Good day and welcome to this special broadcast with myself, Nastasia Arendse. The 55th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum under the theme Collaboration for the Intelligent Age is on our doorstep. As global stakeholders, heads of state and key policymakers, business leaders and social activists are expected to engage and discuss what's in store for the global economy during political fragmentation and conflict. Today's discussion will aim to explore and showcase South Africa's strategic initiatives, goals and leadership in addressing critical global challenges, and in doing so, understand how to reimagine economic growth for South Africa. I'm joined virtually by Sithembile Ntombela, who is the acting CEO for Brand South Africa. Next to her on your screen is Iain Williamson, who is the CEO of Old Mutual. And joining me in studio is Obakeng Makapane, who is an economist, global shaper, and youth activist. Thank you so much for your time and, of course, for those of you who are tuning in. Iain, I'm going to start off with you because all we've been talking about, at least since the election, has been this positive momentum, this positive sentiment that we are seeing on the back of the election results, but also on the back of the GNU. I want you to reflect here in terms of the current narrative, especially as you engage with investors, with stakeholders. If you look back over the past few months or so, your take on it.
Now, there has been a sea change in sentiment, particularly from offshore investors. If I think back to, we were in London talking to investors the week before the election results came out. And at that stage, all anyone wanted to know was what's going to happen. Very nervous. We were in London again following our half-year results in November. And first of all, there was a record attendance at the investor conference that we were at. And secondly, a lot of enthusiasm around South Africa's prospects and a general feeling that we're probably in the best position we've been for a decade from a forward-looking perspective. That doesn't mean we don't have our challenges, but I think the mood and the sentiment is very positive. And if we continue to execute on market-friendly policies, I think we'll attract a lot of capital into South Africa.
In a short bit, I'm going to ask you, in terms of that investor engagement, what are you saying on the other side in response to that? But we'll get to it in a bit. Sithembile, I want to come to you here because part of what Brand South Africa does is that you serve as the custodian of the nation's image. Before we talk about the current narrative, I want you to take me back to last year, this time, coming into 2024 and heading to the World Economic Forum. What was the mood and sentiment, especially given where we were versus now?
Thanks, Anastasia. I look back, I reflect, and I recall we had challenges around energy. WEF Davos early this year, as I would rewind, was very challenging in the sense that we were trying to build a nation brand in a convincing manner in the midst of challenges. And those challenges particularly were driven by the shortages of electricity. This was not just in January this year, but also even the WEF prior. We were faced with many challenges, even around the issues that Iain has touched on, the uncertainty regarding, the political environment and what that would, be, what the impact would be as far as policy direction is concerned. But look, I think as a resilient country and a resilient people, we've demonstrated a will and determination, like we always do, to really rise above our challenges. And I think the collaboration between public sector and private sector is one of our strongest, I would say weapon or rather tool that has enabled this country to rise above its challenges, but more so to forge ahead, breaking new grounds, changing the narrative and showing the real true reasons to believe in South Africa. So a lot has changed since then, Anastasia, and I really look forward to a WEF now with the new political environment, with the new priorities that are really anchored on ensuring that this country moves forward, because we cannot have a country that we are promoting when we are not delivering on the brand promise. So a huge challenge really lies on our shoulders, but I'm glad that we do have collaborative partners that are always willing and able to show up in platforms such as WEF Davos, because they are quite strategic. And for South Africa to have a voice in those platforms, it is quite critical. As you would recall, when you are out of sight, you are out of mind. And I think that's what precisely we're trying to do, intentionally build a strong nation brand.
Right. Sithembile, we'll unpack all of that in greater detail. Obakeng, I want to come to you here because you wear three hats. On the one side, you're an economist, you're a global shaper, but you're also a youth activist. Taking into consideration what both Iain and Sithembile have highlighted, let me tap in first on the economist and the youth activist side in terms of how you're feeling right now based on the headlines that we've seen around where South Africa is.
Thank you for that question. Firstly, I'm very excited to be part of the World Economic Forum Global Shapers as the curator of Johannesburg. I think they have provided us a platform where youth voices are heard, and that's something that has always been missing in the world. We're building a sustainable world or a sustainable global environment where the old people won't be there to experience it, but rather it will be the young people who will take on those spaces and be leaders, right? And I believe that young people, or rather a young demographic in a country becomes the country's demographic dividends. So if you invest in young people, you get the returns, not now, but later on you will get those returns. And when we look at the macro stability side of things, with South Africa, we need a very stable country. And the only way we can achieve that is if all systems work together. Like Sithembile has pointed out, the partnership between the private sector as well as the public sector is quite important. But also integrating young people in that sector and making sure that you upskill them with the right skills to be useful leaders and leaders that can make a difference becomes very, very important.
Before we talk about the economic aspects, I want to step back to some of the things that you've said here, but let's break up the idea of a global shaper. What is the global shaper community? And I suppose from your perspective, just so that the audience can understand how you all fit in the greater sort of vision of what the World Economic Forum is, what is your mission as a global shaper?
Okay, so back 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum formed a group of young leaders who were under the age of 40, but not really 30. So they were the ones who were making change on the ground and getting involved in community projects, making a difference on the ground, right? And then they discovered that there are leaders between the ages of 18 and 30 who want to make a difference, but they don't necessarily have the experience and the skill set yet. So how about we create this community called Global Shapers? And that's where I then fit in. And some of the missions around Global Shapers is making sure that the young people have a voice at the World Economic Forum, but also are able to make a difference in the communities that they are in. That's the easiest way for the World Economic Forum to be able to hear about what is happening at community level. So for example, with Johannesburg, some of the projects that we focused on is around education. Last year and a bit of this year, we were focused on educating people around voting. Why is it important to vote? And we become the voices for our leaders who don't necessarily have that ground access.
All right. Iain, let me come to you here because in your first response, you told us that it's a sea of change in terms of where the narrative is compared to where we were last year. In fact, even a couple of years ago. But let's get into that. I mean, I can imagine in that interaction with the investors, there may have been some who are asking, well, what is the difference between this current euphoria, this excitement, this positive momentum versus the euphoria of 2018, which was dubbed Ramaphoria? How were you responding to that?
No, that is a question we get asked. You're absolutely right. My response has been, look at the evidence. And what I mean by that is look at the real data that's emerging. If you look at what has happened, just for example, with energy, where we are now versus where we were a year ago is a sea change, genuinely. Some of the other pieces of promising output around things like, the interest rate levels, the rand, the prospects for inflation, and the fact that inflation itself has come down materially all point to a concrete data that speaks of, if not a tailwind for the economy, at least no longer a headwind for the economy. And most economic forecasts are projecting improved economic growth for next year. It's still not at the levels we need by any stretch of the imagination. We're sitting, depending on who you believe, we're sitting in sort of 1.5 to 1.8% kind of forecast growth levels for next year. We really need to be in a category of 4 to 5%. So I think there's a lot of positivity around what has happened. I think there's also a positive sense of goodwill around the prospects for further improvement, depending on policy direction and real implementation of, things like the improvements to logistics, solving the problems of the Durban port, some of the issues that have been sorted out at Transnet, and the results of the compact that Sithembile referred to between business and government are, I think, really starting to pay some dividends. So I think there's a combination of people looking at what actually already happened and looking at that data, as well as almost projecting forward a less jaundiced view, I guess, of our probability of making real progress given the track record that's been established and the positive working relationship that's been created. So I think that's really it. And then, of course, the things like the budget speech or the medium-term budget policy statement, I think landed two things. One, it landed a continuing commitment to fiscal responsibility from Treasury, but it also landed a slightly sobering view of the forecasts for the country. So I think there's a bit of realism that's mixed in with, I think, the optimism. But having said that, as I say, people are certainly prepared to give us the benefit of the doubt at the moment that we'll continue to make progress and continue to improve the trajectory.
With that said, let me stay with you here, Iain. In working out, or rather in unpacking that data, as you engage with the investors, as you sit down with your economists, and you hear all of these growth expectations and what we need to be able to see in order for us to maintain a steady or an increase in growth, what's realistic right now, given the momentum that we're currently on? When you're working it out, what seems realistic here?
I think the 2% sort of territory is realistic for next year, for 2025. And I think the things that need to happen in order to shift a gear up into the 3-4% territory where we really need to be are some slightly tougher policy decisions and slightly more fundamental things. A few examples would be things like cutting red tape for the informal sector to be able to establish businesses and get traction. That is a very big part of our economy. It's not very well measured, but the evidence is that it's significantly more difficult for example, a street side trader to open for business and start trading in the average South African city that it is internationally. We need to do further work on infrastructure around, we've sort of seemed to have got on top of the electricity crisis, and that on a forward-looking basis, that looks like it's sustainable, and if anything, might improve even further. Water is one of the next big things. I've already mentioned the logistics piece, which I think is making good progress, and again, there's good data supporting that. But as I say, that delta that we really need will come from some more fundamental reform around really regulatory clarity for investors of capital who will invest in industries that support growth. That's the crux of it for me.
Right. I would love to, at some point in the conversation, get into the conversation around the investors and the sectors that they're willing to sort of plug in and move capital into. But Sithembile, let me come to you here, and perhaps you can let us in the room for those who've never attended the World Economic Forum, but they are following those conversations as they come out. Behind the scenes, what are the engagements like, and what's the role then when you're at Davos as Brand SA?
So our role as the custodian of the nation brand will always be centered around how we position the narrative of South Africa. Having said that, we are instrumental in spear championing what we call Team SA, which really sort of brings all the role players from business, government, civil society under one roof to align on messaging so that we have one posture. Because obviously when you're building a brand, the last thing you need is conflicting messages. So we play that role of a Team SA that does the coordination together with our Team SA partners, and really to bring the experience of WEF Davos to life. Our role is to showcase South Africa's strength. The brand has taken a knock in terms of competitiveness over the years, in terms of how the global world sees our competitiveness level. So our job, simply put, is then to collaborate with business, to collaborate with the civil society, and really shape the narrative at Davos of moving that needle in terms of profiling our attractiveness, profiling our competitiveness levers. So what will happen, for instance, is on a day one, we will start with the media engagement session where we invite global media. That is critical, very strategic, because it sets the tone for what is to come in that week of Davos, in terms of the sectors, in terms of the national priorities, but also in terms of the brand presence itself. So we get an opportunity really to bridge the gap between reality and perceptions. Then we do a number of series in terms of roundtables, thought leadership platforms, where those are thematic, and they are thematic based on the priority sectors. They are thematic based on the areas that we need to elevate in terms of profiling South Africa. And those run out throughout the week. But the most important one is how we show up as a country, is the SA Night. Over the years, we have been synonymous with a country that is quite anchored on Ubuntu. I mean, we've been cited in global platforms by international influential actors and actresses, and they refer to us as a nation of Ubuntu. So those values, they come alive when we host what we call a South African night. And as you would know, we have the chairship of G20. Next year is going to be very imperative. And how we show up is really going to matter, because we not only tell the story of the investment, of investing in South Africa, we also showcase our competitive advantage pillar, which is anchored on creative arts, particularly arts and culture. So we get to have the world experience our food. Often in the past, we've brought a South African chef with us for a reason, because positioning has to go beyond just, the dialogue in the boardroom, formal sessions, but really people have to breathe and live the brand. And that's where we get to showcase even our talent through music, so the entertainment bits. But also we've had instances where we even have either His Excellency President Ramaphosa, or we have the Minister of Finance addressing the room, and that in that room, it's not just South Africans speaking to South Africa, but it's South Africans speaking to the global community, the decision makers, the policy makers, and those are the people that actually are quite critical and crucial for our mandate. Because if we are there and we are articulating a story or telling a story about South Africa, that does a job that would ordinarily cost you so much millions to do if you were back at home. But now you are in one platform where you show up, and you show up with a solid value proposition that can resonate with many. And I think South Africa has really done pretty well. And we have an opportunity now to almost unpack what this G20 entails to the audience. And who could have thought that an African country could be the host of a G20? So that also shows you a positioning platform for us when we say we are a country that punches above its weight, but we also have facts, because we host, mega events such as BRICS, we host mega events such as the G20 that are of global importance, and they're discussing issues, of that are globally have been even identified, whether it's an Ipsos report or whether it's the WEF risk report. So that is going to be our agenda. And of course, we have the voice of business and their constituencies, where they are attending various forums. And for us, what is important is the breakfast that happens before we even leave South Africa. And that breakfast is led by the National Treasury together with Brand South Africa, where we really get the message alignment and the point of departure between all parties, so that there is one take out about South Africa, where we deal with messages and how we will address issues that are currently, sort of crippling us as a brand. So Iain spoke about the issues such as the ports that we are facing and we're dealing with, the issues such as, crime and corruption. So those are the issues that we, Brand South Africa, are also quite privileged to sit in a joint strategic oversight meeting that is chaired by His Excellency President Ramaphosa. Really, that is earmarked to provide solutions, and it's a build up of business as well as government. So you get those influential parties, stakeholders that are custodians of those stumbling blocks, for instance, that are crippling us, and they come back and they report. So for me, that shows us, that shows the world that we are very serious about moving the nation brand forward, but also the country forward. We know we have to deal with issues of economic growth. The economic growth will also come when perceptions are good. So in that platform and the program of Team SA, we are really focused on changing and shifting those perceptions in a positive manner.
Right. Obakeng, let me come to you, and building on what Sithembile said in the idea of shifting perceptions. If you take me back to the World Economic Forum, your first attendance, I think it was last year, if I'm not mistaken. Or rather this year, 2024, if I'm not.
No, I didn't.
It was like, okay, so that's fine. But let's talk about the work that you do as a youth activist and in engaging with the youth. Sithembile spoke about the idea of perception and sentiment. When you're engaging in your activities as a global shaper, what is the perception from the young people around where we are right now, and what areas need to be amplified a little bit more in order so that we have that youth engagement a little bit more higher, more pronounced, so we can imagine a South Africa 5 years, 10 years from now that has reached the targets that we are envisioning?
Firstly, I want to touch on what Iain said. There are a lot of opportunities in high impact sectors. So the renewable energy space, the agriculture space, the digital technology space, right? And that's where we see a lot of young people dominating, or rather being able to have a voice. And that is kind of where we focus on as well as global shapers, to say, where are the startups? How can we then help you get in touch, or use this platform called the World Economic Forum, get in touch with certain investors? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about young people coming forward and raising their voices, but rather we need the public sector to come into play. We need the private sector to come into play. So I've noticed that with young people, they need the financing behind their startups. They need those skills from the private sector, and they need the research and development from the private sector to kind of guide them into the direction of, these are the businesses that are making the most amounts of money. This is where economic growth kind of lies. And once we have that interrelationship between government and the public sector, then we can see the impact that young people can have on the global stage as well as on the African continent. It's so exciting to go around the continent and connect with younger people who are working on things like renewable energy projects. You get to see the brilliant minds of young people and what they can achieve, right? But also, this is not to take away from the older generation, because there has to be some intergenerational sectionality where we meet together and say, we need your expertise, we need your experience, but we also need you to hear us and finance some of the ideas that we have. Again, Iain touched on the red tape that exists in South Africa. It does not just exist in South Africa, but we've seen it on the African continent. When young people apply for funding for their projects, then they have to go through rigorous processes. And that becomes costly, but also that becomes quite discouraging. So encouraging government and the public sector and the private sector to come together and support young people in the agriculture business, in the renewable energy spaces, and in the digital technology will enhance and grow the economy even more, not just for South Africa, but also Africa as a continent.
Iain, taking into consideration what Obakeng has mentioned, I mean, When you're sitting as the business community, as the private sector, how do you imagine a world in which you're able to co-create a South Africa that envisions and has an idea of where young people should be more embedded? When you think about that idea of co-creating that future for South Africa, what does that look like for you as Old Mutual?
Well, let me take a quick step back and just make a quick comment. You know, Africa as a continent, and this includes South Africa, has the most favorable demographic profile in the world by a long, long way. You know, if I just draw a very quick contrast, Japan loses at the moment one big city a year in population, just purely because of the aging nature of their society. And so as a consequence, you know, economic growth in that kind of environment is very difficult to come by. And the developing world, by and large, has this problem to differing degrees. Africa has exactly the opposite nice to have situation, which is that, you know, if you look out to 2040 and 2050, we will have the biggest working age population in the world as a continent and one of the healthiest dependency ratios, the ratio between economically active people and their dependents. So, but what's required to unlock that potential is a vibrant economy with a job market that is inclusive enough to bring young people into the workplace and allow them to add that value. That requires a whole lot of building blocks. So I can certainly envisage it, and I think it's a dream that we should all aspire towards. But it does require us to, fix our education system, fix our informal sector, fix our skills programs for young people, so that when they come into the workforce, they can be upskilled and enabled to become productive contributors. So I think there's a piece of the problem that has been described around, let's say, the more skilled and educated part of our young populace. I think that's one part of the problem, and that's a relatively easy piece to solve. I think there's enough entrepreneurial spirit and enough, there's a good technology hubs and what have you springing up around a place to enable startups to mobilize capital into those kind of opportunities. I think the more fundamental problem we absolutely have to grasp as a country and really deal with is the problem of essentially inequality and access to a meaningful way to further myself, further opportunities for myself, further my skill set, and take ownership for being able to provide for both myself into the future as well as my family as I grow older and have dependents. If we get that right, I think we can be an absolute economic powerhouse. But there's, as I say, there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle that are currently missing or not well enough developed. So we need to be realistic about some of those challenges and really tackle them as well. So if I bring that back to how Old Mutual thinks about it, we fundamentally take a view that what's good for our customer base is good for us. And we take a view that in order for us to be long-term successful, we have to have a sustainable, healthy customer community that is willing and able to consume our services. So that plays into the notions I've spoken about how do you make sure that people are adequately educated? How do you make sure they're empowered to consume financial services in a responsible way? How do you make sure that we feed the economic growth required to build the jobs that we want for everybody? I think that sounds like a big, ambitious agenda. So obviously you then have to break that down, and we tend to play then in the spaces where our natural skill sets and our intellectual property can be brought to bear to assist. So we play in the arena of financial education, infrastructure development, infrastructure financing, the green economy, solar energy, wind power, student housing, schools infrastructure, etc. We invest in a lot of those things, and we're privileged to have the kind of balance sheet that allows us to take a long-term view and to invest in these kind of infrastructure projects that will assist the economy in the longer term.
Right. Let me stay with you, Iain. I mean, speaking of investments and allocating capital, Obakeng also touched on some of the sectors that she's seeing young people wanting to increasingly participate in. Whether it's these sectors or perhaps other sectors, over the recent engagement that you've had with investors, which sectors are investors willing to plow in capital right now? Or are you getting a sense that they still want to see that concrete data, that sustainability of that 2% growth with perhaps even a 3% reduction on the budget deficit?
No, I think there has already been a shift in capital flow to some extent. I think more will come with more data and sort of momentum behind us. The sectors that seem to be in favor at the moment, and some of these are indicative of just the nature of where policy certainty exists, and some of them are indicative of natural cyclical trends in a particular industry. So if I look at the tourism sector, for example, is booming at the moment in South Africa. Agriculture is doing very well. The only the port situation as far as agriculture is concerned has improved year on year. It needs to improve further, but has improved. So those areas get interest. I think the mining sector still has a lot of potential to attract foreign capital, but there I think we do need absolute certainty around the mining rights issues. Ultimately, if you sit back and think, if it was my own money, what would I do? If I'm sinking, whatever quantum of 1,000 rand of my own money into something which is going to have to only pay back over a 20 to 30 to 40-year time frame, which is often what's involved with these big capital projects. You want as little uncertainty as possible around the prospects for the rules of the game changing. So absolute clarity around the rules of the game helps. I'm not really getting a sense from investors that they, certainly the ones I talk to, that they have a particular preferred sector or not at this stage, but it is more around those principles of, what it takes to make something bankable and for capital to flow. A final point I'd make is, at the end of the day, this is an internationally competitive sport, if I can put it that way. And we play in a league where we compete with the other emerging markets. So you can think about the likes of Brazil, China, as sort of natural competitors for our capital, for capital flow. And it includes places like Turkey and Russia and what have you. So we're actually in a relatively good position at the moment. Partly because we've done relatively well recently, and partly because some of the competitors in the league are scoring some own goals. So that helps us, and long may that continue. But we need to just stay on the front foot and continue to provide that and build that trust and build that confidence. It takes a little bit of time. It'll take a few years, I think, of repeated just progress for people to start really giving us credit. But at the moment, as I say, the competitors are scoring own goals and we should take advantage. And the job that Sithembile and her group do around helping us to just land those messages almost helps to accelerate that positive sentiment and accelerate the prospect that people are prepared to give us a chance.
Sithembile, on the back of what Iain's just said, some of our competitors are scoring their own goals. How hard does it become for you as Brand SA to market South Africa in a world where we are seeing, economic nationalism, we are seeing fragmentation, we're also seeing some of South Africa's friends fight against each other? How hard does the job become for you and the team?
Firstly, I think we must acknowledge that, people are people, countries are countries. So you'll always find different views, conflicting views. But I think what matters is the outcome and how the issues are addressed. So from where we are sitting as Brand South Africa, You know, I spoke earlier on about a need to bridge the gap between reality and perception, precisely because there could be a narrative that says the geopolitical tensions, you know, between country A and South Africa, you know, is getting out of control. And our job is merely to pull back that narrative and showcase that actually business continues. We may argue. In fact, arguments, constructive discussions, I believe, are a futuristic way of projecting where policy goes globally, so that there is no nuanced or one school of thought or dictator in terms of country that sets the tone in terms of how countries should operate. So I think it's quite good and healthy to have those robust discussions. But for us, because I think it's important as well to understand the country's posture and understand what the country means and what the country stands for. So identity becomes important, knowing your strong areas so that you can box cleverly and intentionally. And luckily for Brand South Africa, we do have a perception study that we have commissioned ourselves. And this study essentially looks at the issues that the global community looks at when they Google, or rather they do a Google search in South Africa. And we've been privileged enough to find that tourism still remains one of the strongest pillars that we could leverage on in profiling South Africa and shaping the narrative of South Africa. And that is evident with some of the awards that we've won as a country, or be it in a city or as a country, the Telegram's Travel Awards as a way of an example in tourism. But also it doesn't end there. This research also gives a very clear indication in terms of our foreign policy and our posture in investment. So the world is looking at South Africa to look at investment opportunities. It's not Brand South Africa saying this, but it's empirical data that has been proven that actually it means we are a country that has a diverse economy, that we do know that our basket is quite diverse. It's not like we are anchored on a particular product or specifically one area sector. We have multiple sectors, and in each play their role. So for us, the job that needs to be done there is to profile those areas that are driving that perception around investment. The latest entry was while people Google, which is our talent. And when they look at talent, they look at two things: the skills in South Africa, the skill set, but they also look where to study. Now, we know that our universities are also, when we compare within the African reports, they are within the top 10. Most of our South African universities globally, we do make an entry in the top 100. So that's how then we lean on that lever and we shape the narrative about a South Africa that is not just about tourism, but a South Africa that has quite a number of opportunities, a number of ways to come and invest in this country, despite the geopolitics, despite the fragmentation that exists. I think when there is a little bit of noise and dust for any other country, we know that when the country is cemented in one point of positioning their brand and they know the direction because the leadership is setting that tone and we follow suit with leadership. If we get it right at that level, and I think South Africa is doing that, we integrate our KPAs and our KPIs. We ensure that when we report, we also report on an impact-based approach. So I'm happy that most of the public sectors have adopted the theory of change, which is really looking at impact-based performance rather than ticking the boxes. That tells me that we are a country that is now ready really to move a needle. And I think our narrative will continue to be the best as long as we know the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is to position this country as an attractive investment destination in the African continent. That also finds expression in the country investment strategy that has been led by the presidency. So alignment is very key, because it almost consolidates and shapes this strong narrative. I mean, you can be a Nike brand and a Nike brand that has to do with performance. If you continue to produce, running shoes that will make you feel like a winner. So we are a South Africa that says, try us. We are a country that matters. We are a country that inspires new in different ways, because there's always a new story in South Africa, one way or the other. And I think one low-hanging fruit that we really need to plant is also the fact that with the export pillar has been shaping South Africa. And I speak about the country of origin. Now, it's not only restricted to, for instance, agro or automobile, but I'm talking about even the creative arts industry, where we've been able to create ourselves and entrench our identity through our music. I mean, the Amapiano, as a way of an example, has taken the world. And this comes after your Makosas of the world have taken over with this pillar of rich culture and heritage. And I think, I can go on and talk about Mom Esther. I can go on and talk about the ordinary South Africans, but we need to also even look at those areas, those sectors, and look at sports and say, what is the business science behind those pillars? If it's our competitive advantage, therefore, how do we make it work for us? And what policies do we introduce in place to enable, investors to come into this country? And I bet you most of these investors, they have they have their sports that they love. They have, everybody listens to music. And I think there are other ways to get people to come into South Africa beyond, beyond the issues in the environment, whether we're talking politically. But I think we have been that country that's been able to transcend through all the tough times. And again, I'll sound like a stuck record, but it is that resilient. And people often say, well, every country, especially in the African continent, is resilient. And I say, but there is no resiliency that is comparable to South Africa. We are almost beyond extraordinary, because we are able to somersault very quickly. So that is the resilience I'm talking about, not the resilience that says our can be a victim.
Sithembile, also picking up that passion that's coming through from you, and that patriotism, which I'm sure South Africans are appreciating. Obakeng, you've been nodding in agreement as both Iain and Sithembile have shared their points. Take me through some of the points that stuck out for you. I mean, your thoughts on what they've mentioned.
So both Iain and Sithembile mentioned something about the world shifting in a different direction, right? And I think for South Africa and a lot of the developing countries, this is a very exciting time. So what we've seen is there's a level of uncertainty as to where everyone else is moving towards when it comes to trade agreements. How do we then trade with each other? What are the cross collaborations are we looking at? But for developing countries, this is a great opportunity for them to now go back to the drawing board and say, I have this and I want to trade it with you for this, right? And those partnerships that are forming, we see the attraction that has happened now with BRICS. BRICS has existed since 2009, but as of recent, there has been a big hoo-ha around BRICS and the currency that is now going to be formed by BRICS. We all know that that is not the root of the noise around it, but rather the partnerships that have now formed with all these developing and emerging economies. But what this has provided is an opportunity for us to take center stage and say, these are the resources we have in our country. These are the things that exist on this continent, and this is how we want to manage them. And it makes me so proud that African leaders are now taking a stand against the Western side of things and saying, for you to be able to do your business here, you need to understand our culture. You need to understand the diversity that is existing on the continent, and specifically for South Africa as well. You need to be inclusive in your solutions as well. When we look at renewable energy, technology, agriculture, arts, culture, and everything else that is existing, they need to understand who we are and how we operate for them to be able to invest and grow their businesses here. So that makes me very, very excited.
All right. So what we've done so far in terms of conversation, we've looked at the fact that the World Economic Forum, the theme is going to be collaboration for the intelligent age. but it also breaks down into five themes, five distinct themes, which the panel this afternoon have touched on. We've looked at reimagining growth. We've touched a bit on the idea of rebuilding trust, especially when we live in a world where there's this multipolarity that is happening within geopolitics. But we've also touched on some of the industries as we imagine what an intelligent age looks like. But the one thing we haven't touched on yet, which is quite interesting and is quite important, is investing in people and looking at the human capital side of things. Because as much as we're sharing those messages to the world about where South Africa is competing for skills against countries like the Gulf countries like Singapore, etc. Many other countries are looking for the skills and the talent that is within our borders. Iain, let me come to you here. As Old Mutual, as the financial industry, how are you dealing with the idea of human capital, attracting capital, retaining capital, especially when you have economies that are thinking, well, we want to be competitive, and we're going to be competitive by attracting the best of the best, even if they come from South Africa?
I think there are quite a number of dynamics under that question. First of all, let's acknowledge, I think there is a real skill shortage in South Africa when it comes to some of the critical skills. So we talked earlier about tech and digital and data skills. We haven't talked about, but I'll add to that, all the financial engineering, etc. skills. If you think about what's required to invest in the electricity grid in South Africa and what the level of infrastructure build is that's required underneath that, the engineering skills to put all that together are a big issue. So I think it goes much wider than Old Mutual's approach, which is to clearly to be an employer of choice in the areas of skill that we deeply care about and that are deeply necessary for the success of our business. For us, that's mostly around accounting, actuarial, technical, IT, and some engineering skills. So we invest in those through either university bursary programs, through on-the-job training, and through skills academies. So, for example, data science skills academy, those sort of things. And we also, through our industry body, we invest in skills development for things like financial advisors and those kind of careers and professions. Having said all of that, I think there's also a dynamic around things like remote work. And so increasingly skilled foreigners are finding it attractive to base themselves in South African cities and work remotely, the gig worker kind of phenomenon. So we are attracting people who find the lifestyle, the quality of life, and the relative cost of living in South Africa attractive. Equally, we have lost people in the last few years and skills in the last few years to immigration because of some of the uncertainties that existed, I think, mainly prior to the GNU coming into force. So ultimately, I think it comes back to, how do we build that skills pool? How do we ensure that we have enough and that we remain competitive as employers in terms of the career paths we provide to people, the level of development and growth opportunities we provide to people. And we need to be very conscious and very deliberate about how we go about doing that.
Right. Obakeng, let me come to you. I mean, given what Iain's just said, but I think also in our conversation around some of the sectors that young people are finding themselves interested in, how do you imagine businesses being able to support in training and, upskilling youth that are employed? I mean, how do you imagine it as a global shaper, but also from the work that you're doing as a youth activist and engaging with the young population?
I think there are 2 points here, right? The first one is we need the public sector to train young people, not just on the skills that are the private sector to train young people, not on the skills that they need as a company. So Iain, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring you into this, but as Iain mentioned, Old Mutual will go out and train young people. But what then happens is Old Mutual will go out and train young people on the skills they need as a business, right? So the skills don't become transferable, and we need young people to be trained on skills that are transferable. That way, when they do move away from that specific corporate or that specific public sector job, they're able to move on to the next big thing and they're able to make a difference. So I think that's a challenge for the private sector. Another challenge is for government to support private sector in the form of subsidies so that they can then use that money to absorb all these young people. Now, for private sector to make money and be profitable, they need a healthy business environment. Things like load shedding affects it, the ports, the infrastructure developments in the country. So those things can then trickle down and affect youth employment. The other side of it is going out and not looking at just the urban area. When we speak to young people are across the country. We need people to go out to the rural areas and see what young people are doing there, right? And see what skills they are lacking. Because it's one thing for a young person to come up with an idea and have a brilliant idea on how to solve a problem that affects them in that moment. But for them to upscale it and make it a business is a completely different thing. There are certain aspects they don't understand, like financing, how to pitch, for example. You know, we did a pitching competition last year and we had to train these young people on how do you pitch to an investor? What information do you put there? What kind of data do you put there? And because their ideas are so brilliant, you just want to give more to them and say, there is an opportunity, the funding is there, you just need to know how to pitch yourself and show up into these spaces. So the challenge for, again, private companies or the private sector, making sure that you equip the young people with skills that are transferable and ensuring that you open up the space to train them, whether they want to go into entrepreneurship or they want to end up in the corporate environment. Sorry, this is the last point. Yeah. We have seen brain drainage. I didn't think it was a thing until some of my friends moved to London to work for big corporates. So I think we need to go and challenge young people as well as government to say, how do we keep that talent in the country? We see people go out the country to go study but never come back because of the environment or the labor laws in the country or the salaries or the diversity, equity and inclusion part. So these are different moving parts, but I think if we can get them right and we can align on strategies as the public, private sector, as well as the educational institutions, then we are able to retain the talent and grow the skill set of young people in this country.
All right. So with just around 7 minutes left of this broadcast, Iain, I'm going to come to you here before I get to Sithembile in a short bit here. But in the environment that we're currently in, I mentioned those 5 pillars, but the one that is quite, at least will be unpacked in great detail at the World Economic Forum is the idea of safeguarding the planet. And this is where the themes of sustainability and ESG come into play. As a business, how are you managing some of the ESG trade-offs in today's business environment?
Yeah, I actually think that the world has moved beyond, or certainly we have moved beyond seeing that as a trade-off. You know, we have an active policy, again, because of, as I said, we enjoy the privilege of being able to take a long-term view with our balance sheet, and we do invest a very material amount of capital on behalf of our clients. But we have very clear policies around what we will and won't do when it comes to the notion of particularly the climate-related aspects and the carbon emission-related aspects of investing. So, you know, we are the largest investor in wind and solar energy, I think, on the continent, as a consequence of an active policy of seeking to deploy capital into areas that assist with both the energy shortage as well as the issues of replacing damaging capacity from a climate perspective with cleaner capacity. We also play quite a big role from what I like to think of as almost a thought leadership perspective as an insurer, because we have a vested interest in, for example, managing flood risk. So the flood events that we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal and in the Western Cape last year, etc., have a material impact on us from a profitability perspective. So we have a vested interest in making sure that the policymakers and others understand the impact of what is happening So we've done some very detailed geocoded models around flood risk. So we can, isolate the riskier areas of the country and less risky areas by the exposure to weather problems that are likely to cause flooding.
Yeah.
What that means is we can do two things. One, we can obviously price for that risk, but secondly, we can have a conversation with the likes of municipalities and others around how they think about urban and spatial planning, how we think about town planning. Let's make sure we don't build new property developments in floodplains and in areas that are exposed to runoff risk from being on the side of steep mountains and what have you. So we've done that, and we've done quite an extensive level of engagement across particularly KZN in that regard.
Yeah.
But I think it's really around the ethos of saying what I described earlier. Given the IQ and the skills we have, where can we make a difference? How can we make a contribution? And where can we play our role? And there are many places where we can't play a meaningful role, or other people are better equipped to play that role than we are. But particularly in the areas of understanding risk, in the areas of understanding the long-term consequences of how you think about how you build your infrastructure, how you set up infrastructure to be bankable, to attract investors. We have skills in all those areas. So we tend to lean into those conversations.
Right.
We also lean into our investee companies. So where we are invested in various companies across the country, we lean into the conversation with their leadership, with their boards of directors around how they are thinking about how they play their role in managing, for example, the energy transition in a just way, how they're thinking about how they mitigate the climate impacts of their activities, etc. So we call that active stewardship, and we do that both on behalf of the customers where we physically invest money, as well as on behalf of third-party clients who we almost play a consulting role too in that regard. So that's just a few practical examples of how we try and make a contribution.
Yeah. Sithembile, as we get to the end of the conversation, as we close off this discussion, we've spoken about what the message is going to be, but we've also reflected on some of the engagements previously. Next year, this time, when you and I have a conversation, what will the success of the road to Davos, Team South Africa, what will it hinge on? When you and I have a conversation, what will be the one thing that you hope to have achieved?
Certainly without sounding like a soothsayer, but I can tell you, Anastasia, that I think we'll have a number of collaboration, which has been almost synonymous with the past WEFs, where we've given birth to new projects. So I'd like to keep that momentum going. But I also think inward looking, would like to bring in more solutions that will enable this country to move from a place of good to great, through initiatives that can benefit the layman on the street. So that is what I'm really hoping for. And I believe that the strategy of a push and pull, in the sense of us pushing what government strategies are, particularly, as Obakeng said, we are very much about youth, and we believe the success of this country is really reliant on the empowered youth, the upskilled youth. So I really hope this time we'll be talking about those tangible projects that have come alive or that are imminent, that really came out of the session of WEF Davos 2020-25.
Sithembile, thank you so much for those words. Well, that's how we wrap up today's discussion. Thank you to my guests, and I will begin in studio, Obakeng Makapane, who was next to me, who is an economist, global shaper, as well as youth advocate. Then we had Iain Williamson. He is the CEO of Old Mutual. And lastly there, you heard the voice of Sithembile Ntombela, who is the acting CEO for Brand South Africa. From me, Anastasia Arendse, until next time, it's a goodbye for now.